Have you ever had religious impulses, Lord Russell?
Oh, yes. When I was adolescent, I was deeply religious. I was more interested in religion than in anything else, except perhaps mathematics. And being interested in religion led me, which it doesn't seem often to do, to look into the question whether there was reason to believe it. I took up 3 questions. It seemed to me that God and immortality and free will were the 3 most essential questions. And I examined these one by one in the reverse order, beginning with free will. And gradually I came to the conclusion that there was no reason to believe any of these. And that I thought I was going to be very disappointed, but oddly enough I wasn't.
But how did you come to convince yourself there's no reason to believe in any of these 3 things?
Well, over free will, I think the argument was not a valid one, and I don't any longer think it was at all conclusive, but I thought that because I thought that all the motions of matter are determined by the laws of dynamics, and the motion of a man's lips when he speaks must be so determined so that he can have no control over what he's going to say. I don't think that was a valid argument, but that convinced me at that time. About immortality, well, it seemed to me quite clear that the relation of body and mind, whatever it may be, is much more intimate than is commonly supposed, and that there's no reason to think that a mind persists when a brain decays. And as for God, well, there are a great many arguments that have been advanced in favor of the existence of God. And one and all, I thought and still think that they're invalid, and that nobody would have accepted such arguments if they hadn't wanted to believe the conclusion.
Do you think that it is certain that there is no such thing as God, or simply that it is not proven?
I don't think it is certain that there is no such thing. No, I think that it is on exactly the same level as the Olympic gods or the Norwegian gods. They also may exist, the gods of Olympus and the gods of Valhalla. I can't prove they don't, but I think the Christian God has no more likelihood than they have. I think they're a bare possibility.
Do you think that religion is good or harmful in its effects?
I think most of its effects in history have been harmful. Not all. Religion caused the Egyptian priests to fix the calendar and to note the occurrence of eclipses so well that in time they were able to predict them. I think those were beneficial effects of religion. But I think great majority have been bad, and I think they've been bad because it was held important that people should believe something for which there did not exist good evidence, and that falsified everybody's thinking, falsified systems of education, and set up also what I think complete moral heresy, namely that it is right to believe certain things and wrong to believe certain others, apart from the question whether the things in question are true or false.
But do you mean there's a kind of censorship of thought that goes on, which prevents free thinking?
I do, yes. I mean, if you take practically any school in the world, any school for boys and girls, you will find that a certain kind of belief is taught. It's one sort in Christian countries and another in communist countries. But in both, something is taught, and the evidence for what is taught is not impartially examined, and the children are not encouraged to find out what there is to say on the other side.
Well, what is it that makes man, over the centuries, demand a religion?
I think mainly fear. man feels himself rather powerless, there are three things that cause him fear. One is what nature can do to him. It can strike him by lightning or swallow him up in an earthquake. One is what other men can do, which is that they can kill him in war. And the third, which has a great deal to do with religion, is what his own violent passions may lead him to do, the things which he knows in a calm moment he would regret having done. And for that reason, most people have a great deal of fear in their lives, and religion helps them to be not so frightened by these fears. But the founders of religions, I say religions in the plural, have very little to do with what their followers teach. Very little indeed. To take an illustration, I've found that military men in this country think that Christian belief is very important in the contest with Eastern powers. And they think that if you're not a Christian, you won't be so vigorous about it. Well, I read the Sermon on the Mount over again, and I couldn't find a word in it to encourage H-bombs, not a word.
Much of what you're criticizing happened a long time ago, but what about today?
Oh, no, it's just the same today. This illustration I gave you about the H-bombs is certainly not antiquated yet. I wish it were. And I think that at this present day, religion, as embodied in the churches, in the main discourages honest thinking and gives importance to things that are not very important. Its sense of importance seems to me quite wrong. Now, when the Roman Empire was falling, the fathers of the church didn't bother much with the fall of the Roman Empire. What they bothered with was how to preserve virginity. That was what they thought important. Well, now...
What did they do about that, sir?
Well, they exhorted people and didn't bother about seeing that the armies held the frontiers or anything like that, or that the taxation system was reformed. They were occupied in founding monasteries and nunneries and so forth, and thought that far more important than preserving the empire. Well, so in the present day, when the human race is falling, I find that eminent divines think that it's much more important to prevent artificial insemination than it is to prevent the kind of world war that will exterminate the whole lot of us. And that seems to me to show a lack of sense of proportion.
Yes, but wouldn't you agree, though, that many organized religions have done a tremendous amount of good in spreading education where perhaps no other system has been available, as in Burma, say, where the monks have done a tremendous amount of educating the poor, where there aren't any organized schools?
Well, I think it's possible, yes, and I think the Benedictines did a certain amount of good in that way, but only after doing the harm. They first did a great deal of harm, and then a little good.
But then what about people, though, who feel that they must have some faith in a religion, otherwise they can't face their life at all?
Well,
you take that away.
I say people who feel that are really, they're showing a kind of cowardice, which in any other sphere would be considered contemptible, but when it's in the religious sphere, it's thought admirable. Now, take the whole question of the very dangerous condition that the world is in. I get letters constantly from people saying, oh, God will look after it. But he never has in the past. I don't know why they should think he will in the future.
You think this is a very unwise doctrine to follow. It ought to be self-help rather than depending on somebody else to do it for you.
Certainly, yes.
But then if, though, a religion is harmful, and yet man has always insisted on having one, what is the answer?
Oh, man hasn't. Some men have, and those are the men who are used to it. In countries in the land, for instance, people walk on stilts, and they don't like walking without stilts. And religion is just the same thing. Some countries have got accustomed to it. But now, I spent a year in China, and I found that the ordinary, average Chinese had no religion whatsoever, and they were just as happy, I think, given their bad circumstances, happier than most Christians would have been.
But I think a Christian would say that if he could convert them into being Christians, they'd be much happier.
Well, I don't think that's borne out by the evidence at all.
Yes, but now, doesn't man rather search for some cause or faith outside himself, which appears to be bigger than himself, not merely a question of cowardice or leaning on it, but also wanting to do something for it?
Well, but there are plenty of things bigger than oneself. I mean, you start, first of all, there's your family, then there's your nation, then there's mankind in general. And those are all bigger than oneself and are quite sufficient to occupy any genuine feelings of benevolence that a man may have.
Do you think that organized religion is going to go on having the same grip on mankind?
I think it depends entirely upon whether people solve their social problems or not. I think that if there go on being great wars and great oppressions and many people leading very unhappy lives, probably religion will go on, because I've observed that the belief in the goodness of God is inversely proportional to the evidence. When there's no evidence for it at all, people believe it, and when things are going well and you might believe it, they don't. So I think that if people solve their social problems, religion will die out. But on the other hand, if they don't, I don't think it will. Now you can get illustrations of that in the past. In the 18th century, when things were quiet, a great many educated people were free thinkers. Well, then came the French Revolution, and certainly English aristocrats came to the conclusion that free thought led to the guillotine, and so they dropped it, and they all became deeply religious, and you got Victorianism. And the same thing again happened with the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution terrified people, and they thought that unless they believed in God, their property would be confiscated. So they believed in him. So that I think you'll find that these social upheavals are very good for religion.
But do you think that you and I are going to be just snuffed out completely when we die?
Certainly, yes. I don't see why. I know that the body disintegrates, and I think that there's no reason whatever to suppose that the mind goes on when the body is disintegrated.
Lord Russell, what is your definition of fanaticism?
I should say that fanaticism consists in thinking some one matter so overwhelmingly important that it outweighs everything else at all. To take an example, I suppose all decent people dislike cruelty to dogs. But if you thought that cruelty to dogs was so atrocious that no other cruelty should be objected to in comparison, then you would be a fanatic.
But do you think this has happened a great deal in human history, that large groups of people have been seized with fanaticism?
Yes, it's happened at most periods in most parts of the world. It's one of the diseases of the mind to which communities are subject.
Which would you say were some of the worst occasions?
There have been various occasions one could mention. Take anti-Semitism. That is one of the most dreadful, because that's the worst manifestations of that are recent, and were so dreadful one can hardly bear to think of them. Well, that, though I know it isn't the right thing to say, it isn't considered the right thing to say, but anti-Semitism mainly came in with Christianity. Before that there was very, very much less, but the moment the Roman government became Christian, it began to be anti-Semitic.
Why was that?
Because they said that the Jews killed Christ, and so it gave them a justification for hating the Jews. I've no doubt there really were economic motives, but that was the justification.
But why do you think people do get seized in large numbers with fanaticism?
Well, it's partly that it gives you a cozy feeling of cooperation. A fanatical group all together have a comfortable feeling that they're all friends of each other. They're all very much excited about the same thing. You can see it in any political party. There's always a fringe of fanatics in any political party. And they feel awfully cozy with each other. And when that is spread about and is combined with a propensity to hate some other group, you get fanaticism well developed.
But might not fanaticism at times provide a kind of mainspring for good actions?
It provides a mainspring for actions, all right, but I can't think of any instance in history where it's provided a mainspring for good actions. Always, I think, for bad ones. Because it is partial, because it almost inevitably involves some kind of hatred. You hate the people who don't share your fanaticism. It's almost inevitable.
But then if it gets taken over by economic considerations, say that like the Crusades, then fanaticism disappears and perhaps does no harm.
Well, I don't know. I can't think of any good that the Crusades did. The Crusades had, of course, two different streams in them, a fanatical stream and an economic stream. The economic thing was very strong indeed, but it wouldn't have worked without the fanaticism. The fanaticism provided the troops and the economic motive the generals, roughly speaking.
But what part would you say that witchcraft has played in fanaticism?
Oh, witchcraft played a terrible, terrible part, especially from about 1450 to about 1600, a little longer than 1600. Quite terrible part. There was a work called The Hammer of Female Malefactors, which was written by an eminent ecclesiastic and inspired just mad profusion of witch hunts, which the people themselves believed. I think it's very likely that Joan of Arc believed she was a witch. Certainly a great many people condemned as witches did believe they were witches. And there was an enormous spread of cruelty. Now, Sir Thomas Browne, you would say, when you read his works, he seems like a very humane and cultivated person. But he actually took part in trials of witches on the side of the prosecution, and he said that to deny witchcraft is a form of atheism, because after all the Bible says thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and therefore if you don't think it's right to burn the people you think witches, you must be disbelieving in the Bible and therefore be an atheist.
But how is it that quite sane people, on the surface at any rate, can be fanatical?
Well, sanity is a relative term. Very, very few people are sane all through. Almost everybody has corners where they're mad. I remember once I was motoring in California on a very, very wet day, and we picked up a pedestrian who was getting wet through, and he inveighed against all kinds of race prejudice. He said it was the most dreadful thing. I entirely agreed with him. And then somebody mentioned the Philippines, and he said, all Filipinos are vile. Well, you see, he had that little corner of insanity.
But why do you attach so much importance to the subject of fanaticism?
Because a very great part of the evils that the world is suffering are due to fanaticism. A very, very great part. Always has been so, and it's worse in the present day than it's ever been before. I don't think fanaticism is more prevalent, but it is doing more harm than it has ever done before in human history.
Well, can you elaborate that a bit?
Yes, certainly. It deserves to be elaborated. I think that the East-West tension, which is threatening us all in the most terrible fashion, is mainly due to fanatical belief in communism or anti-communism, as the case may be. Both sides believe their own creed too strongly. They believe it in the way that I defined as fanatical, that they think, that is to say, that the prevention of what they regard as wicked on the other side is more important even than the continued existence of the human race, and that is fanatical. And it is that fanaticism which is threatening us all, a fanaticism which exists on both sides.
What's your definition of toleration?
Toleration consists, well, it varies according to what direction you're thinking. Toleration of opinion, if it's really full-blown, consists in not punishing any kind of opinion as long as it doesn't issue in some kind of criminal action. And toleration of opinion is the first form of toleration that arises.
Well, can you give some illustrations of periods in history which have been tolerant?
Yes, and it really does begin with the end of the 30 Years' War. It didn't begin in England until a little later because we were in the middle of our civil war at that time. But it began very soon after that. And the first really tolerant state was Holland. All the leading intellects of the 17th century at some period of their lives had to take refuge in Holland. And if there hadn't been Holland, they'd have been wiped out. The English were no better than other people at that time. There was a parliamentary investigation which decided that Hobbes was very, very wicked. And it was decreed that no work by Hobbes was to be published in England. And it wasn't till a long, long time.
Would you say that ancient Athens was a tolerant state?
It was more or less tolerant. It was more tolerant than modern states were until the 18th century. But it was not, of course, completely tolerant. Everybody knows about Socrates being put to death. And apart from him, there were other people. Anaxagoras had to fly. Aristotle had to fly after the death of Alexander. They were not wholly tolerant by any means.
But how is one to know when one's got to a tolerant period? I mean, how does one recognize this?
Oh, you recognize it by the liberal freedoms. Free press, free thought, free propaganda, freedom to read what you like, freedom to have whatever religion you like or lack of religion.
But now, pretty well in the West, this exists today, and yet you were saying just now that we've never been in a period where there was more fanaticism.
Well, I don't think it's true that it exists. I mean, take, for instance, what they did in America, which was to go through all public libraries, and any book that gave any information about Russia was destroyed. And you can't call that exactly tolerant.
If you're not enthusiastic, you don't get things done. But if you're over-enthusiastic, you run the danger of becoming fanatical. Well, now, how do you make certain that what you're doing is all right and that you haven't become in a fanatical state?
Certainty is not ascertainable. But what you can do, I think, is this. You can make it a principle that you will only act upon what you think is probably true. If it would be utterly disastrous if you were mistaken, then it is better to withhold action. I should apply that, for instance, to burning people at the stake. I think if the received theology of the ages of persecution had been completely true, it would have been a good act to burn heretics at the stake. But if there's the slightest little chance that it's not true, then you're doing a bad thing. And so I think that's the sort of principle on which you've got to go.
Would this apply to political parties and governments?
Oh, certainly it would. I mean, everybody who belongs to a political party thinks the other party's in the wrong. But he wouldn't say, therefore, you have a right to go and assassinate them. There are certain things you may do when you think a party isn't wrong, and certain things you mayn't.
But what do you think of the limits of toleration? I mean, you can get into a situation where you have complete license and chaos.
Well, the general principle there is that people should be allowed to advocate any change in the law that they like. But in general, though I don't say this always by any means, in general, you should not permit the agitation for a definitely illegal action prior to a change in the law. You may advocate a change in the law, but you shouldn't advocate an act which is illegal while the law stands as it is. I don't say this is an absolute principle, but usually